Yes, so here we are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Linda Veldhuis. I would like to welcome you to this e-conference, and it's about the latest evidence on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. Now, this e-conference is organized by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a network of knowledge institutions worldwide that want to contribute to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, our group within this network focuses on sustainable agriculture and food systems, and we want to connect experts and practitioners, just like we'll be doing over the next few days with this e-conference. If you want more information on what we do or how you could contribute, you can go to our website, which is unstsn.org. Now, we are very excited to welcome more than 900 participants to this e-conference, and many of you are from Africa, Europe, North America, and Asia, and we also have some people from South America and Australia. And we have many people from civil society, academia, international organizations, and also quite a number of people who work for the private sector or government. And the goal of this e-conference is to share the latest evidence on nutrition-sensitive agriculture, as the name says. So we've prepared 3 very interesting live sessions of about 90 minutes, where experts will share their insights and where you can ask your questions. We've also created an online community that you have all been invited to. So please go online after this session and continue the discussion, ask your question, share your work, and meet colleagues from around the world. For today, if you have any questions for Matin, you can submit them in the chat box that's on the right of the screen here. And we will use this in the discussion that follows after this presentation. Over to you, Jess.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to join us. It's going to be a very exciting 3 sessions to look at a very timely topic that very much relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 2, looking at the links between agriculture and nutrition. Today, we're going to talk about nutrition-sensitive agriculture. Nutrition-sensitive interventions or programs are those that really try to address the underlying determinants of malnutrition, food security, adequate caregiving resources at the household, maternal, and community levels, and access to health services in a safe and hygienic environment. Nutrition-sensitive agriculture looks to maximize agriculture's contribution to nutrition. It also involves linking agriculture to sectors that address other causes of malnutrition, like education, health, and social protection. There's many pathways through which agriculture interventions can impact nutrition. Marie Ruel and colleagues had recently published an article in the Global Food Security Journal, which I serve as editor-in-chief of, where they really outline these pathways and look at the evidence of how agriculture impacts nutrition. We know that more and more studies and evidence are accumulating over the last several years that are providing a clear picture of where agriculture can make a difference, whether it's through home production, through sales of commodities, through food prices, through women's empowerment and social status. We're going to tackle some of these pathways and look at where there is evidence and where there's not. To get us started for our first day, I am really, really pleased to have Matin Qaim, who's a professor of international food economics and rural development at the University of Göttingen. I know I'm not saying that right, Matin. He's really one of the world's experts on looking at agriculture and its role in nutrition. He's a really smart guy, and I'm really pleased that he's taking the time to be with us. Just a little bit about his background. He's held research and teaching positions at universities of Hohenheim, Bonn, California at Berkeley. He has a doctoral degree in ag economics from the University of Bonn. He looks at he's got many research themes that he looks at, and any of you who have followed his work know that he touches on many different aspects of agriculture. He looks at the economics of food security and malnutrition, sustainable food systems, and smallholder agriculture. He's worked across Africa, Asia, Latin America, has published widely in some of the top journals, and has also been featured in many of the big newspapers like New York Times, Economist, and Newsweek. He's a member of the German National Academy of Sciences, very prestigious, and has been recognized as a fellow of the American Agriculture and Applied Economics Association. And it is a real pleasure to have him here. So he will give a great overview and present some of the evidence on nutrition-sensitive agriculture. And then we'll open it up for a discussion. It's your chance to ask Matin questions of what he presents, and other burning questions that you may have. And we'll try our best to answer them, and finishing right around 4:30. So I will turn it over to Matin.
Okay, thanks, Jess, for introducing me and also for initiating this great conference. You and Linda have been behind that. It's a wonderful opportunity to not only talk about the research that I and my group and others have been doing, giving an overview, but also to do it to an international audience, not only of academics, those people that we often talk to, but people from various organizations and various backgrounds. I find it exciting. I find it also a bit challenging, because usually when you're standing in front of the audience and you're taking eye contact, then you can see whether people are excited or whether people fall asleep. I can see nothing like this right now, so I hope that you will not fall asleep. I'll give my best that you're excited. I'm presenting research. I'm trying to do that in a non-technical way. So, everything that I use in terms of jargon, I'm trying to explain, because I know that you all have different backgrounds. And if there's really something unclear beyond the discussion questions that you have, then of course, feel free to ask me any of those questions also. What I'll do now, I'll share my screen with you so that you can see the presentation that I've prepared. Let's see. Do you now see my screen? Linda, can you give me, or Jess?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, then I go into presentation mode, and because now I don't see anything but my screen, and but it seems to be working.
Yes, perhaps you can
sometimes
just click away the message box at the bottom there, and then it's perfect.
Yeah, how do I click that away? Ausblenden. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Before I start, let me acknowledge Kibrom Sibatu, who is working with me and has been working with me on topics that I'll present for the last couple of years. So I guess and hope that he's also online following what I'm telling about our joint research. And now let me start. You're, of course, all aware that hunger and undernutrition are global problems. They have been global problems forever, and they're still. The latest estimates by the FAO say that over 800 million people are chronically undernourished. And you also know that this figure refers to those who are undernourished in terms of calories. The numbers have been staying pretty persistent at this level, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been any progress. So if you look at the proportion of people who are undernourished in that calorie sense, we were looking at around a quarter of the world population in 1990. And today we are talking about 11%. So that is progress, no question. But it's still 11% too much, of course. So the progress is too slow. It's also uneven geographically. We have seen, particularly in Africa, that many countries are lagging behind, and the number of undernourished people are even increasing in several African countries. We're also seeing that even in those countries that have made a lot of progress in terms of reducing undernourishment in that calorie sense, rates of child stunting, so children that are too short for their age, that remains a widespread problem. And that is a clear indication that looking at calories alone is certainly not enough, because the human body, in order to grow, and in order to be healthy, needs more than just food energy. It needs several nutrients, including lots of micronutrients. And when we look at the figure of micronutrient deficient people around the world, we are rather looking at 2 billion people. And as you know, micronutrient deficiency also has very severe health consequences. Child mortality, infectious diseases, stunting, also impaired cognitive development, and many other things. So it's a serious public health problem, and we need to ask our question: why is it that calorie undernutrition actually declined faster and not micronutrient malnutrition? And a simple answer to that is that food security over the last couple of decades, from a policy and research perspective, has often been a focus on calories, a focus on a few major cereal crops, rice, wheat, maize, and a few others that are delivering calories but are not really rich in micronutrients. This is true from a agricultural subsidy perspective. So you see many more subsidies going into the cereal production. Also from a consumer subsidy perspective, a lot of the food security programs try to make calories cheap so that hunger can be avoided or reduced. If you look at the Green Revolution, so that research-led growth in cereal production, that was also pretty much focusing on rice, wheat, and maize, these three major staple food crops. And that has helped to reduce hunger. It has also helped to reduce poverty, and that's great. But the focus on those few calorie-delivering crops has also narrowed down dietary diversity. And we know that this is causing other types of nutritional problems, as mentioned, and not only micronutrient deficiency, but we're increasingly seeing obesity problems as well in all parts of the world. So what do we need to do? We shouldn't condemn what has happened in the past, because I think those were important developments in order to reduce hunger. But we now need to look forward and see that focus on calorie alone is certainly not enough. We need much more diverse food systems, and more diverse food systems and more diverse nutrition can help reduce what we call the triple burden of malnutrition, that looks at calories, that looks at micronutrients, and that also looks at overweight and obesity. That holds true in general. Now let's look at what does that mean for farming and smallholder farming in particular, because that's the topic of the conference, Nutrition Sensitive Agriculture. 80% of the food in developing countries is produced by smallholder farmers, usually defined as less than 5 hectares, and in many countries less than 2 hectares. But it's peasant family farms that produce most of the food in developing countries. And paradoxically, as you probably know, smallholder farmers are also that group that accounts for most of the undernourished people worldwide, both in a calorie and in a micronutrient sense. So the important question, or one of the important questions, obviously, is how can smallholder diets, the diets in these smallholder farming households, be made more diverse? And one of the intuitive answers might be, well, if we increase the production diversity on the farms, then this will automatically lead to more dietary diversity and better nutrition. But you see here, I've put a question mark behind that sentence because it's not necessarily true. If you look at these two pictures, so is it really true that diverse farm system, as we see it here on the right, will lead to better nutrition outcomes than something that's perhaps a little bit less diverse than what you see here at the left? At least that question, will higher farm production diversity automatically lead to more dietary diversity, is a question that's by many nutritionists answered in a positive sense. It's an assumption. And ecologists also like to answer that question in the positive, simply because there are also possible environmental benefits of more diverse food systems. But when you look at it from a conceptual framework, the answer is not necessarily clear. And I want to tell you what we need to consider. If you look at those two boxes here, the blue boxes are those that relate to production. and the red boxes are those that relate to consumption. And of course, if you're looking at a purely subsistence farm that produces everything that's consumed in the farm household, then the answer to the question whether more production diversity leads to more dietary diversity is clear and straightforward, yes, because the household will only consume what it produces. But that's the extreme case. We know that the subsistence in the pure form without any market interactions hardly exists. So households will most of the time also make food purchases from the market. And in order to do so, they need cash income. Otherwise, they can't purchase anything. And cash income, in agricultural households comes primarily from sales of agricultural products. And the question is whether when you have a very diverse farm, whether that has a positive or a negative effect on the sales of agricultural products. I think this is situation specific, but it's not necessarily clear that this pathway will always be a positive one when we increase diversity. In addition, smallholder farm households, most of them also have some form of off-farm income, and that certainly also contributes to cash income, and therefore the relationship is not very clear whether production diversity will necessarily lead in better nutrition. Of course, one can analyze that empirically, and that's what we want to do in the following. When we look at the data availability now, we're seeing that there are lots of data sets that we can use in order to answer those questions. But only about 10 years back, that was quite different because there were data sets that were capturing all those blue things, namely what's happening on the farm. And there were separate data sets that were capturing household consumption aspects, but those were different agencies, different data sets, and it wasn't really easy to get them together. So in the last 10 years or so, data availability has improved, and now we're much more able to analyze those links. And we have started to get concerned and to ask those questions some 6-7 years back. And when we ask what was the evidence available at that time, say 2012, 2013, 14, around those 5-6 years back, well, there are a couple of studies that are case studies that have analyzed the impact of specific nutrition intervention projects, such as the promotion of kitchen gardens, for instance. Those projects usually show that dietary diversity and nutrition is improved in the households that introduce or start growing vegetables, for instance, in a kitchen garden. And I think this is an important result. But those projects are not only introducing additional crops, they're also providing a lot of nutrition training, awareness building, technical support, and so on and so forth. So the case studies are interesting, but we cannot necessarily say that this means that just adding additional crops will lead to more or better nutrition. There were at those times very few studies that used broader nationally representative data. And the 2 or 3 studies that existed at that time found positive associations between production and consumption diversity. So yes, there seems to be a positive association, but what should we conclude when just looking at positive associations? Is increasing the number of crop or livestock species on a given farm always the best strategy to improve the diets in the farm household? Well, we don't know. And that was the reason why we started to do a couple of studies. We looked at data from various countries, and we also recently carried out a meta-analysis to take together all the available evidence that has been accumulating over the last few years. So I want to now present both, give a little insights into the different country studies, and then also present the major results of the meta-analysis one by one. Let me start with the country studies that we did. We had data from 5 different countries. The 5 countries are shown in this table here. Indonesia from the Asian continent, and the other 4, Kenya, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Uganda from the African continent. These are pretty large data sets, partly from our own data collection, partly from the national statistics. Especially the LSMS ISA data for a few African countries. And when we look just at the average farm size in those data sets, we see, okay, there's quite a bit of variation. We have, 4.5 hectares in Indonesia as average farm size, and then we have, Malawi with only 0.7 or Kenya 0.7 hectares. Now, we are interested in the relationship between production diversity on the farm and dietary diversity, and we measure production diversity in terms of the number of the different crop and livestock species that a farm produces. And we measure dietary diversity in terms of the number of food groups that households consumed over a recall period of 7 days. And we use 12 food groups as the maximum. That's the food group classification that's used for the household dietary diversity score. So we didn't invent that. That's what we took from the literature. One can take other measures than those, and I'll have a few words on other measures, but let's start with these very simple measures for production diversity and dietary diversity. And I want to extend this table here and show that, well, in terms of production diversity, this is the average for the countries here. We see that in Indonesia, it's very low, less than 2 species per farm, and it's going up to 10 and more in Ethiopia. And we also see that in terms of dietary diversity, we have quite a bit of variation. Lowest dietary diversity in Ethiopia, so that means less dietary quality also, and the highest in Kenya. But there are interesting things. When we look at Indonesia here as one of the extreme cases, we see that Indonesia actually has a relatively high dietary diversity and a very low production diversity. And when we look at Ethiopia, we see that Ethiopia has a high production diversity. So the farms produce more than 10 different crop or livestock species on average, and a low dietary diversity. Now, this would almost tell us that, well, perhaps the opposite is true, that high production diversity leads to lower dietary diversity. And I should caution, no, we should not make that conclusion because this is very, very simple descriptive statistics here, not controlling for anything else. But what we see from those 2 examples is that high production diversity seems to be neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for high dietary diversity. And that's something that we can take from this very simple table. Now we want to get a little bit more sophisticated. We can certainly try and look at the association between dietary diversity and production diversity, this PD here, controlling for other factors such as farm size, education, gender, other assets of farm income sources, and so on and so forth. So we can run those as regression models, and that's what we did. I'm now showing you some of the results, not all the results in detail. This is first of all a result for the pooled data sample that includes the observations, the 8,600 observations from all 5 countries. And we are seeing that production diversity has a positive and statistically significant effect on dietary diversity. This HDDS here is the dependent variable. So, okay. But let's also look at the size of the coefficient here, which is a marginal effect, 0.1, which means that increasing production diversity by 1 crop or livestock species increases the consumption by 0.1 additional food groups. So that's small. So that means if you really want to add 1 full food group, you would have to produce 10 additional species on your farm. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. There is a positive association, but a relatively small one. And when we introduce a square term, we are seeing that, well, there's a negative association with a square term, which means that this effect gets smaller at farms that are highly diversified already, which makes sense, right? If you already produce 10 or 15 different crops, and then you're adding, then the additional effect is not as big anymore. When we introduce a couple of the control variables, not all are shown here. We are seeing that things like market access, which is defined here in distance to the next market, that those have positive and larger effects than this up here, and also off-farm income. So this gives us a first indication that, yeah, there's a positive association, but it's not very large. And other things such as market access in particular seem to be at least as important, if not more important, for increasing diets and dietary diversity in smallholder farm households. One can argue, okay, the pooled data sample, 5 countries with very different conditions. Let's look at the countries separately. We have done that. And now I'm only showing you the production diversity results. Those regressions also include all the control variables. But interestingly, what we are seeing is there's some variation here. We have Uganda where the effect is bigger, 0.2. But still not very big. And we see a few countries where it's much smaller and it's even not statistically significant. So yeah, that's those results. And when we ask for, okay, probably also within countries, the effects may vary. Yes, when we take the example of Malawi, and this graph here shows this is the average effect of production diversity on dietary diversity. This is the 0.13, one of the figures that you saw in the previous table. And when we now disaggregate by looking at those who are further away from the market, that effect gets slightly bigger. So this means people who are less connected to markets, who are further away from the market, for them, production diversity is getting more important, and that makes a lot of sense. But we see at the same time those people who are better connected to markets, production diversity plays a smaller role, which is not statistically significant anymore. Also, when we look at other indicators of markets and market access and market participation, we see that selling some or all of the maize has actually big positive effects on dietary diversity. So this is just showing that using markets, making cash income allows you to purchase more from the market, and also things such as selling other crops and using fertilizers, which is an indicator of market participation on the input side. They have effects that are bigger on dietary diversity than those effects here by just increasing the number of crop or livestock species produced. So what have you learned so far? That's not my final slide. It's only an intermediate conclusion. We have learned that farm production diversity is positively associated with dietary diversity in some situations, but not in others. We have also learned that the mean effect size is relatively small, and it's decreasing with high levels of farm diversity, and it's also decreasing with better market access. And now, as I promised, we need to ask the questions, okay, perhaps the indicators that we use for production and consumption diversity are a little bit simplistic. Can we rely on them, or what happens if we change the indicators? Let's look at the indicators on the production side, first of all. Remember that we used the simple species count. So if a household produces, say, wheat and sorghum and beans, then that would be 3. Independent of how much of these crops are produced, well, you can weight by area. You can create indices such as the Margolef species richness index and make the production diversity indicator a bit more sophisticated. We've done that, and we are resulting in similar conclusions, or basically the same conclusions, and that does not seem to be one of the things that's really driving the results. One can also say, yeah, okay, but then there are certain non-edible cash crops, such as cotton or such as tobacco, and all those cash crops. Perhaps we need to exclude them and only count the number of food crops produced. Well, we can do that, and the conclusions remain the same. We have tried those robustness checks. What about looking at the number of food groups produced? So not individual crop species, but the number of food groups. Let me explain. When a farm produces wheat and sorghum and rice, then all three are cereals, and those cereals belong to the same food group. So we would count 3 species, but only 1 food group. And we can also count food groups, also obviously on the production side, and that's what's leading to what can be called the food production diversity score. And then we would expect that the effects get larger, right? Because when you're producing more food groups on your farm, then you're also likely to consume more food groups. Interestingly, here is the comparison. This is the simple species count. Those are the numbers that you have seen in previous slides. This is now only looking at 3 countries because we didn't have the appropriate data for all 5 countries. But we see in Uganda, for instance, indeed, when we use the food production diversity score, the effect goes up a little bit from 0.2 to 0.3. But on the other hand, for the pooled sample and for Indonesia, the opposite is true. The effect goes down. And that may surprise on first sight. How can it be that if a farm produces additional food groups, then the effect of the diversity goes down? I think this correlation is actually the answer to that. We see here that in the pooled sample and for Indonesia, we see a negative correlation between the food production diversity score and the cash income. And this is because if a household really focuses on only producing the food groups that it needs for consumption, then it's perpetuating subsistence and it's reducing the cash income that it's generating from sales. And we have already seen that, well, obviously, cash income is also important for purchases of diverse foods. So this is telling us to come back to the conceptual framework that the pathway here, the direct subsistence pathway, may be positive if we increase production diversity, but it may be negative here as we saw from some of the examples, and therefore the overall effect may be small as we saw. How about looking at variations of the indicators of dietary diversity and dietary quality on the consumption side? So the HDDS, this household dietary diversity score, is a widely used measure, but it's not without its critics. It also includes unhealthy food groups, such as oils and fats, such as sweets, such as beverages. And it's certainly possible that households that purchase more food are getting more of these unhealthy food groups. Well, we can test for that by redefining, not using HDDS, but using different food group classifications that exclude unhealthy foodstuffs. We have done that, and we're coming to the same conclusion. So the results do not seem to be driven by HDDS being the measure that we used in the first place. Another critique is that all the dietary diversity scores just count the number of food groups without accounting for the quantities consumed. So even a tiny quantity of some leafy vegetable will be counted as a food group, but perhaps the quantity is too small to deliver sufficient micronutrients. So what can you do? Well, if you have the proper data available, you can calculate micronutrient intake levels by using food composition tables and looking at the actual quantities consumed. And we did that, and the conclusions did not change dramatically. How reliable are the 7-day food recall data? Well, it happens that in many of the surveys, the standard household surveys, you have 7-day food recall data. But of course, it's a long recall period and it's less precise than 24-hour recall data. And In most data sets, they're at the household level, when in reality, food intakes take place at the individual level. And if you're interested, and that's of course important, what happens within the household, intra-household distribution, then we need to ask the question, how reliable are household level dietary diversity scores? Well, we do have a data set that we collected ourselves together with some partners in Malawi, where we do have both household level and individual level data and 7-day and 24-hour recall data in order to make comparisons. And we see that this is based on 24-hour household level, which is very similar to the 7-day result that we saw previously. And we see that also the individual level data for children and for mothers here, of course, the exact values are different, but the effect of production diversity is positive, significant, but relatively small in magnitude also when we use those individual level 24-hour recall data. And also the other results on market access and off-farm income playing actually a stronger and larger role, they do not change. So in the end, we have to say that, of course, measurement matters and every indicator has a different nuance that it shows, but the overall conclusions do not seem to be driven by how we measure the production and consumption diversity scores. So this is the individual studies. Let me now show you a little bit of the meta-analysis because what happened in the last 5 years, this is really a hot research topic, and many research groups and many papers were published on similar analysis of associations between farm production diversity and diets. So when we carried out a meta-analysis last year in 2018, we identified 45 studies by different teams that have analyzed those associations, and most of them were actually published in that time window, 2014 to 2018. If you'd look today, 2019, there are probably a few additional ones, but we completed that in 2018. And when we look at, first of all, what are the main conclusions of those 45 studies, when we look at the original author conclusions, and you can easily, when you read the abstract or when you read the conclusion section, you get a sense of what is the main message that the authors want to tell us. And in 69% of the cases, the authors mentioned that there is a clear positive association between farm production diversity and diets. 9% mentioned that they're mixed results. So when they were using some indicators, they had positive. When they were using other indicators, they did not have positive or sometimes even negative. Some of them also looked at subsamples like those nearer to the market or in one region and in another region. So 9% of those 45 studies talked about mixed results, and 22%, so more than 1/5, did not find any positive association. The interesting thing is that reading the abstract and conclusion is one thing. If you look at the full papers and look at all the results that they're presenting in their papers, we classified the papers, and we found actually that there are only 11% of the papers, of those 45 papers, that found clearly positive associations for all the analysis that they did. And that 65% actually found mixed results, so positive for some of the analysis and non-positive for others, and about 1/4 no positive effect. The interesting thing on top of this is that hardly any of these studies made an attempt to interpret the effect size. So they just looked at the sign of the association and the significance level without interpreting the size of the association or the size of the effect. And we tried to do that. In the 45 studies, we found 213 individual regressions with different model specifications, different explanatory variables, and so on and so forth. And out of these 213 regressions, only 51% of them showed positive and significant associations between farm production diversity and dietary diversity or dietary quality, we're looking at the average effect size across those 213 regressions from 45 studies. We are seeing an effect of 0.06. This is even smaller than the 0.1 that we found for the countries that we analyzed in more detail. So it means that you would have to produce 18 additional crop or livestock species in order to increase dietary diversity in the farm household by one food group. So that's an extremely small effect. It's significant, yes, but it's small. And when we look at the studies and regressions by geographical area, we are seeing that in Africa, the effect is somewhat larger. Probably because subsistence orientation is still stronger in Africa, and in other regions it's actually getting very small and statistically significant. Now, when we were looking at those results, we were saying, okay, actually it's a bit surprising. I mean, we're talking about subsistence or subsistence-oriented farm households, and of course they eat a lot of what they produce on their farm. And why is this effect actually so small? And I think one of the important reasons has to do with understanding the food sources of smallholder households. When we are talking about smallholders being subsistence oriented, then this means that they are consuming a large part of what they produce at home. So it means that if they produce 100%, then they may be consuming 70 or 80% at home. But those numbers do not tell us how much they actually purchase. And therefore, subsistence orientation is usually measured on the production side. So how much of what they produce is kept for home consumption, but you can turn it around. How much of what people consume is actually coming from their own production? And that is often much less than 70 or 80%, as this graph here shows. This is Ethiopia, where we have a data set that also captures seasonality. And it's looking, the blue line up here over the year, the total kilocalories consumed in rural smallholder households. We see the green line is what comes from subsistence, and the red line is what's coming from the market purchased. And for calories, we're probably not surprised to see that more is coming from subsistence. If you average over the year, it's about 60% from subsistence and 40% from the market, from purchases. But that's calories. The same data and the same graph is now looking at number of food groups. So that's dietary diversity. And we see that dietary diversity, on average, around 6 food groups that are consumed. And we are seeing most of this is actually coming from the market, 80% or so. And the share of the different food groups coming from subsistence production is actually relatively small. So this means, yes, many smallholder households focus on cereal consumption, cereal production, and they get a lot of their calories from home production. But that's not necessarily the case for the dietary diversity. And of course, that's Ethiopia. We cannot say this is the same in all other countries, but Ethiopia is certainly one of the countries where subsistence orientation is relatively pronounced. So from the available data that we have from other countries, the situation doesn't look very dramatically different. So that means, coming back to the conceptual framework, actually, that a lot of the dietary diversity really comes from the market. And that means, okay, we could now say, yeah, but perhaps that's bad. Perhaps households should produce more, but that would certainly mean that they're more oriented towards subsistence. And we feel that promoting market access and promoting commercialization of smallholder farming will be the better strategy to make farming more nutrition sensitive and improve dietary quality in smallholder farm households. And we have also analyzed the links between agriculture commercialization and nutrition specifically. This is also an area of research that has gained importance in the last few years. We have collected data in western areas of Kenya from smallholder farm households. And what these are around 850 households randomly selected. And we see here that those who are more subsistence oriented, so those blue columns here, have higher rates of undernourishment in terms of calories, but also in terms of major micronutrients as compared to the more commercialized households, so those orange colored bars here. Now, of course, this is a simple comparison, and it may be due to the fact that the more commercialized farms are just the larger farms, and therefore they have more assets, they are richer. Okay, that may be true, but we can control for those factors and run a regression model where we say, well, the intake of calories and micronutrients is a function of the level of commercialization of the farm, and then controlling for all those things like farm size, assets, and education, and so on and so forth. And I'm showing you the result here from this type of regression. And we see that for calories and also for iron and zinc, the commercialization has positive effects on calorie and micronutrient intakes, which are statistically significant, indicated here by the little stars. Don't be surprised about the magnitude. I mean, this is measured in kilocalories. As you know, an adult may need around 2,500 kilocalories. So this is somewhat less than 20% here increase. Iron and zinc, adults need around 15 milligrams. So these are also quite large effects. The only thing which has a positive but insignificant, it's not statistically significant effect, is vitamin A. And vitamin A, adults or especially adult women may need around 1,200 micrograms per day. So this is relatively small and it's not statistically significant. So obviously commercialization has positive effects on calorie, iron and zinc intakes, but not on vitamin A intakes. We can look a little bit deeper into that and analyze, okay, we can disaggregate by what comes from purchased foods and what comes from subsistence production. And those are the effects of commercialization. We are perhaps not surprised to see that commercialization has positive effects on the intake of calories and micronutrients from purchased foods, which is, by the way, also positive and significant for vitamin A. And then we see it has relatively small and statistically insignificant effects for what comes from subsistence. And that may be surprising because we may argue, well, if they sell more, then at the same time, they will have less from subsistence. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And that may be due to the fact that more commercial orientation may also lead to higher productivity, better access to technologies, and therefore on their small farms, they can have more production. There's only one exception, and this is a negative and statistically effect on vitamin A. So vitamin A seems to be a bit special. And that's not only true in Kenya. Similar results are also found for many African countries. And we need to understand, okay, where are people obtaining most of their vitamin A from? And in poor households, in rural areas of Africa, most of the vitamin A comes from green leafy vegetables that contain beta-carotene that then the human body converts into vitamin A. But the local markets for green leafy vegetables in this part of Kenya, they're not well developed. And this means those households who are more commercialized actually reduce their green leafy vegetable production. Sometimes they stop it even because that has no commercial potential. They cannot sell. The markets are almost inexistent for green leafy vegetables. And that's, of course, bad. So the question is, what can we do in such a situation? One option would be to tell those farmers, well, grow your green leafy vegetables such that you have more, that you avoid reducing a reduction here in vitamin A intakes. But the other and probably the better recommendation would be, well, improve the markets for green leafy vegetables. Once you get those markets going, improve the infrastructure, improve the demand, then there's a commercial incentive to produce more of these vegetables, and that will also lead to more production in the commercialized households, and therefore to higher vegetable consumption in those commercialized households as well. One final example, this is also from Kenya, but those are different parts of Kenya. So the previous example was from the western regions in Kenya, and now we are looking in the Nairobi area, where supermarkets in Nairobi and those urban areas there have been growing and have becoming really more important in food retailing. And those supermarkets in Nairobi, they like to sell fresh and green leafy vegetables to their customers. And in order to ensure that they always have sufficient supply of these vegetables in order to sell them to the urban consumers, they're contracting farmers to produce green leafy vegetables. And those contracts with supermarkets are certainly an incentive for farmers to grow and to sell more of these green leafy vegetables. And we have been analyzing that situation for a number of years, and we are finding that farmers that have access to those supermarket contracts benefit significantly in terms of higher incomes, but they also benefit in terms of improved nutrition because they're also consuming more of these green leafy vegetables, including those that they do not sell to supermarkets. So some of the excess production. And to look at some of the regression results we see here, so the regression works in a similar way as the previous one, but now we're looking at the effect of having a supermarket contract for green leafy vegetables, and we are seeing that this has a positive effect on calorie and micronutrient intakes, including and especially large here for vitamin A, because the green leafy vegetables are the most important source of vitamin A. So this is not to say that supermarkets will solve all those problems. They won't. This is just one example to show that, well, when we can find mechanisms to get the markets for green leafy vegetables and some of those other perishable foods going, and we have market-led incentives for farmers to grow these, then we can combine the production and the consumption of healthy and diverse foodstuffs better than if we focus on subsistence alone. So let me summarize with a few points of conclusion. I think we have seen from these analyses that increasing farm production diversity does have a positive effect in some situations, but doesn't seem to be always the best strategy to improve smallholder diets and nutrition. So we saw that improving market access is likely more promising in most situations. And of course, I mean, in the end, it depends very much on the particular context, but generally speaking, a certain level of on-farm diversity helps farmers certainly to cope with risk and also has ecological benefits. So we should not go to the other extreme and say farmers should specialize in a way that they only produce one or two crops. But on the other hand, we saw on some of the tables that farmers in many African countries produce more than 10 different crops. And the question is, okay, where's the optimum? And when you're at 10, is it then really useful to increase further to 12 or 15 or 20? And I believe that's not the case. It would rather be strengthen markets. When we look at, I mean, my statement that we need more diverse food system, that certainly holds. But the level of the system diversity is not necessarily equal to the level of the diversity on every single farm. So it doesn't mean that if in total, there should be 100 different foods that the food system comprises, that every single farm needs to produce 100 different foods. So we need to look at the scale, and it doesn't mean necessarily for every single farm that the more, the better. So what are a couple of messages for policy, I think what is really important is we need to abolish the policy bias towards staple grains that we have seen for various decades, and that is just too narrow in order to promote diverse food systems and healthy nutrition. We certainly need to strengthen markets for neglected foods. I've mentioned the example of green leafy vegetables, but the same holds true for certain fruits, that holds true for a number of pulses and other legumes. So there are so many areas that where market development has really been neglected, and that is certainly key. And then let smallholders react to market incentives, and they will, and therefore commercialization and diverse food systems is not at all a contradiction, but it should be market-led, and we should beware not to perpetuate subsistence, because that does not seem to be the right approach to try and perpetuate subsistence into the future. Well, with this, I need to see how I can get back so that you see me. Okay, I need to find the right button.
Great.
Okay, so now we're back.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a really insightful presentation and such a clear picture of the evidence. Really, really great way to start our 3-day seminar. So we already have lots of questions from the listeners. So let's start to try to tackle some of these.
Sure.
Okay, so one question comes from Pride. How long should one run an intervention like a home garden before noticing impact on the nutritional status? So things like iron, vitamin A, and zinc. What do you think would be the time scale to really see? And I guess you have to define what that intervention is, but.
Yeah, I mean, I answer immediately, right? So
go for it, yeah, and then we can,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if you're not waiting long enough, then you may have not even harvested and not even had any behavioral change. And if you're waiting for too long, there's the risk that things level off. So I think definitely. It's also a question of how you measure things. When you measure things in terms of really dietary data, then it's good to have a program running for at least a year or so, and then measure what people are really eating. It's always good if resources are available to go back, yet 1 year later, in order to see whether the same results are still there. Because it may be that you're enthusiastic, farmers are enthusiastic, trying out a certain thing, and they do it, and then after a while they realize, okay, it's not working, and they give it up again. So. Yeah, I think I would probably wait at least for until the first harvest is in, which is probably minimum half a year, but better 1 year, and then see and do it again if resources permit.
And Matin, when you did your research, you really looked at your final outcome was looking at diets, the diversity and quality of diets. It really wasn't looking at, can you address stunting? Can you address wasting? Can you address obesity? It was more looking at diet as your final outcome.
Yes, that is true. I mean, there are a few studies that look at agricultural type interventions and analyze what they do to stunting and wasting and some of the other anthropometric measures. And many of them show either no result or sometimes very small effects. I mean, there's broader consensus that, of course, these anthropometric measures are the most precise in terms of measuring nutritional status, but they're relatively insensitive to some especially short-term type of interventions. Plus, they are a bit more tricky to interpret from a policy perspective because when you don't have, say, an effect on child stunting, that may be due to the fact that there's no effect on diets, but it may at the same time also be that there's negative health and sanitation that are preventing effects from happening. So I think looking at good dietary data is a good way of assessing dietary quality. But of course, I mean, there's more than dietary intakes. So that does not at all mean that anthropometric measures are not important anymore. It's just the evidence shows us that often it's much more tricky to establish causal evidence on anthropometric measures.
Great. Okay, we're getting lots of questions, and Matin, just a little feedback. Feedback from participants show that your presentation was really insightful and interesting, so that's good. Sonia is asking, and this is a question I had, why do you think the more commercialized farms have less undernourishment? Why is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, that is simply income related, right? I mean, commercialization means that you're producing what you're good at. You're specializing a little bit more. You're having better access to technology. You're having higher productivity. You're having higher income, and that means you're having more access to healthy purchased food, plus perhaps in some cases even a bit more from subsistence. There is, I don't know whether you have separate questions on gender, but there are certainly interesting gender aspects to consider here. Perhaps I'm not talking about this now because there may be specific questions about that. But in general, it's income related, and more commercialized households are doing better in terms of income.
Mm-hmm. We have, maybe we can come back to that. We have two questions that are somewhat similar from Diana and Sharma. Diana asks, has it been possible to factor in nutrition awareness or education at household levels on these results? And Sharma asks a somewhat similar question. Based on your findings, have you come across any farm diversification programs that have integrated nutrition messaging? So I think Diane is asking about awareness and education levels, and is there a factor there that is influencing the results? And then Tom is asking further, what about adding nutrition messaging or behavior change communication? Does that do anything?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely key. I mean, we know that healthy nutrition is not only about income, it's also about knowing what's healthy, knowing what's required, knowing where important nutrients are coming from, and therefore basically all those farm garden, kitchen garden type of projects are usually coming with nutrition messaging, with awareness campaigns, with some training elements, and that makes it that's important, and it's great. It makes it a bit more difficult to disentangle what is really the effect of the garden as such, or the additional vegetables that are produced, and what is the effect of the nutrition messaging. I think getting awareness about health and nutrition and what it takes out to people in rural areas is absolutely key, but it's also absolutely expensive to do that. Yeah, and therefore I think one of the important questions is how can we make those messages cost effective? Because if you send out people to teach groups of households or groups of farmers, and you have to do that in every region on a regular basis, it's usually not done with a one-time session and then suddenly everybody knows what's good for you. You need to really have intensive sessions, participatory sessions, repeatedly, perhaps with some demonstrations, and that is costly. So some of the questions that we have been asking ourselves is, can perhaps the agricultural extension service that is reaching out to many of those areas anyway, can that perhaps be a vehicle to also transport some of the important nutrition messages? Some of the early results that we are seeing is that yes, there seems to be potential, but I think overall we need more research in how to induce behavioral change communication in a cost-effective way, because that is really expensive. It's important. So saying it is expensive shouldn't mean that we shouldn't do it. We need to do it, but in order to reach as many as possible, we need to have cost-effective ways of doing that.
Great. Cecilia asks a question, and this is also a timely question in the global debate. What about the production and consumption of animal source foods? She's not giving more clarity on that, but
yeah,
so the whole animal source food piece. What are your thoughts from a smallholder perspective, the ability to produce and cost of consumption? And
I mean, the first thing is that we know that people who consume very little animal source foods, for them increasing that does have positive effects on nutrition outcomes such as child stunting also. There are nice recent meta-analysis that have been done by Derek Heddy and others that are showing a positive effect of animal product consumption and reduced child stunting. Of course, I mean, that doesn't mean that the more the better. We know the planetary boundary type of questions and all that. But I think in many smallholder systems, we are at such low levels that more will be positive from a micronutrient and healthy diet perspective. The question is, how much can farm households produce it themselves? And here, of course, when we look at cattle, I mean dairy, of course, that is something that's sometimes not the tiniest farms. They're often a little bit larger that have their own dairy cattle. I think there's quite some potential in poultry, in chicken, especially also in the African context. Experience that we found is that oftentimes households tend to sell the eggs rather than keep them for home consumption. So there's an interesting element of what do households consider primarily for home consumption and what for sales. I mean, I think that animals are certainly important for mixed farming systems, and they can contribute a lot to more healthy nutrition, therefore products to improve productivity of animal production and access to the inputs and technologies is certainly something that is important from a nutrition sensitive agriculture perspective.
Yeah, and Shilpa asks a similar question, and she wanted a clarification. Do smallholders sell off the vegetables to get more income, resulting in less nutritional security, especially for women? So it's a bit similar to the egg story in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, our experience from farmers is that you have problems in promoting technologies to farmers or crops or innovations to farmers if this is just for home consumption and they have no ability to sell. So even those things that are primarily grown for home consumption, if farmers know that there's no market, they will have problems when they need cash to sell something, then they will be much more hesitant to adopt that. So I think introducing crops or livestock, additional species should always go hand in hand with also looking that there is a market and that this market can be strengthened. And oftentimes it's not a clear cut either or. I mean, households may want to sell a few of their vegetables because they have immediate cash needs, but when they grow them, then oftentimes they will also consume more of this. So something that's too narrowly just looking at produce what you consume without taking into account that markets are important also as incentive factors for farmers to start doing something is a mixture. And therefore, I think we need to look at this in this integrated fashion and not forget that when we are introducing innovations that are even if they're primarily meant for improving nutrition in the farm households, don't forget the market aspect.
Great. Another question is looking at, did you did your research, did you factor in the scale of production, the farm size?
Yes, I mean, we do control for farm size in all of the models. That's one of the main or most important control variables, because there is usually a positive association between farm size and income. And therefore, if a farm is just or a farm household is just better nourished because it's richer and has a larger farm, then it would be wrong to take that as a result and not control for farm size. So yes, that's important.
Okay. Okay, so we now have 3 questions of gender, and I'm going to put them all together. Maybe you can think about how to address them. So Orkin says, would you agree that gendered aspects of inter-household decision-making define both livelihood outcomes, namely farm diversification and dietary diversity? Shilpa asked, homestead gardens are usually in women's control to ensure diversity. The moment there's commercialization, men become the decision makers. What does your experience say? And in context of that, Peter says he's concerned about the high level of cotton production in Mali and Burkina Faso. What do your conclusions mean in such a context, given the high level of cash produced are often controlled by men, resulting in lower dietary diversity? So somewhat similar questions around subsistence, when cash crops then men dominate, and its role with livelihood outcomes and dietary diversity.
Yeah, I agree with all of those statements and can try to answer them all together. I mean, evidence that we see both from our own research and also from other research groups show that indeed income that is controlled by the women in the household has a bigger positive effect on health and nutrition than if that same income is controlled by males. That is, across regions, across continents, we're finding, a lot of this evidence. Secondly, it is also true, and evidence shows that also from different parts of the world, that when farming gets more commercial, then men often take over control of that income that is generated from this commercialized farming. And in that sense, commercialization may mean that women lose control of income, and that may have a partial negative effect on income. And we do see that, but it doesn't mean that the total effect of commercialization on nutrition is negative. It means that partial pathway through the gendered control is negative, but it may be overcompensated by an overall income gain. But the question, of course, remains, are we satisfied with that? The answer is no, we're not, because the effects could be even better from a nutrition perspective and from a gender equity perspective if we could prevent that loss of income control from happening. I think the worst that we could do is say that all households have to stay subsistent, because otherwise women will lose control of the income. The strategy has to be, let us help farms to link to markets and to commercialize, and let us do that in a gender sensitive way, such that through, again, behavioral change communication, through gender sensitive approaches, we're avoiding that loss of control, and we are strengthening the role of women in the process of commercialization. There are a couple of interesting examples. I mean, some fair trade certification, for instance, they look at who is actually, they're dispersing money for cocoa or for cotton. That example came. They're dispersing that only when both the male and the female, the cooperatives are dispersing the revenues only in the presence of both male and female present. And that's an interesting thing. And that coupled with a couple of gender training sessions is helping really to have men take full control of that income. So I think these are important questions that need more research and that need more best practice examples, but we can't perpetuate subsistence and say, well, otherwise males will take over. I think we need to change behavior, and we need to change gender roles, and we need to strengthen women and foster women empowerment so that commercialization can happen without women losing control. And that's really, really important from a gender perspective and from a nutrition perspective.
Great. So we have a series of questions of different places where you could intervene across the food system. So one's sort of on the production. A couple of questions from Lad, Balai, Jay, both said around biofortification or fortifying flour or grains. That's kind of one point, that whole production intervention and value chain intervention. Sarah asks about markets. What kind of specific characteristics of a market ensure an adequate, high quality diet? So like, how would you design a better market for dietary diversity? That's a great question. And then Emma, Linetti, and Natalia ask about the other extreme end around consumers. What about culinary skills, utilization of food preparation? Are there points of intervention there? So there's sort of the production, the biofortification, fortification, making markets more nutrition friendly. And then what about, how much can we put on the consumers to develop better cooking and culinary skills and food preparation skills? A set of questions for you, Martin.
Okay, this is pretty broad. Let me try. I mean, biofortification, I assume that most people know that this stands for primarily using breeding in order to breed higher contents of micronutrients into crops, and especially staple crops. So you can, for instance, breed more iron or more zinc or more vitamin A into rice and wheat. And this has the advantage that for people who eat a lot of rice and wheat and those staple foods, they get more micronutrients than they would otherwise. Now, of course, we would say, well, biofortification, but isn't the objective that everybody has diverse diets and not only relies on wheat and rice, even if they have more micronutrients? And I say, yeah, of course. I mean, the longer term objective definitely is to have more diverse diets. And if everybody has a very diverse diet, then we wouldn't need biofortification anymore. But it's a long way to go. And of course, we shouldn't look for the blueprint or the silver bullet. And I think, as long as poor people do depend a lot on staple foods, biofortification has a potentially interesting role to play. And the early evidence that we are seeing from, for instance, the orange flash sweet potatoes in several African countries and a few other examples, they are promising. So there's a role to play, and I see the potential really in rural areas where subsistence still plays a major role. And I think their biofortification can be important. The link to markets is also interesting and important here, because farmers will not necessarily start adopting biofortified foods only because it's improving their own household nutrition. They also want to have the ability to sell something in the market. And therefore, as we discussed before, not forget the market and the potential to also market those things. And for things that come with a different color, for instance, that's an important question. I mean, if the rice or the wheat suddenly has a different color, then obviously we need to deal with that from a market perspective as well. The question, how do markets have to be designed in order to be more nutrition sensitive? I mean, of course, that's one of the key questions, and I think what is really important is to improve the infrastructure and to improve the storage and the cooling facilities such that markets for fresh and perishable products are also better working. I mean, markets for cereals are working because they have been promoted a lot, and also because cereals are not very perishable. And the reason that markets for some fresh fruits and vegetables and so on, they don't work as well is really because of the big losses. I mean, when much of the vegetables after transport on a rough road just being, destroyed because of the big potholes and all that. So it's a simple question of get markets for perishable products better going. And I think market infrastructure, storage, and logistics is really key. Mm-hmm. But it may require both. I mean, of course, the private sector is key in developing markets, but it may also require some public sector infrastructure support to get this going and to get those markets function more. And then the question of the consumer. Yeah, of course. I mean, in the end, the consumer demand determines the supply in the end. And if the demand is fairly narrow, then the supply will also be fairly narrow. So, and markets cannot work without there being real consumer demand. So I think consumer awareness building, which does include things such as nutrition education, and that certainly also includes, culinary skills. What do you do when you're unfamiliar with certain vegetables and you don't know, what to do with these things? So I think in the end, it's really important to have that integrated perspective and to understand the importance of markets, but markets cannot work without the consumer. And that's the idea of that term food system to really consider this in an integrated fashion. Yeah, that's in a nutshell. Of course, could say much more about those things.
And we'll finish up. One is on more of harm, and another one is around stakeholders. So one person asked, how does diversified subsistence contribute to addressing obesity? as well as addressing undernourishment. Any work on that you see coming? And I think we all know there was a recent paper in Nature showing that obesity is now higher in rural places than in urban centers. So the obesity pandemic is rearing its ugly head in rural places all around the world. So is there a way to have double duty where you can address both undernutrition and overweight obesity and not cause harm one way or the other in dealing with those?
Yeah, indeed, the growth rates of obesity are often higher now in rural areas. I still think that the absolute level is higher in most urban areas, but there may be some exceptions to that. But of course, we cannot say this is an urban phenomenon and rural areas are out of this debate. On the contrary, I mean, we have that in rural areas, and I think food system diversity is in a way a key to all those nutrition problems, because we do see that higher dietary diversity is positively associated with reduced undernutrition, but also with reduced overnutrition and obesity. Yeah. Of course, I mean the question is how to get the system to be more diverse, and I think yeah, I mean we have to find ways of not only getting the ultra processed foods and sweets and soft drinks out to rural areas, because those markets work pretty efficiently. And we need to just make sure that the markets for healthy foodstuffs are working as efficiently, and that's not easy. But I think the diversity aspect is indeed a triple win in terms of being able to tackle all three forms of malnutrition.
Great. Okay, in our last couple minutes, just one last question from Benahu, which I thought I'd save for last because I think it's an important one, with an additional added question, similar question from Ahmed. Benahu asks, could you name a few stakeholders whom you think should address your conclusions and take actions to improve the situation? And Ahmed went on to say, in your research, is it possible to look at the role, positive or otherwise, of extension services, so maybe they're one of the stakeholders, in supporting production diversity? So Matin, who do you want really to read your research and take action, and who would that be?
Well, I think that a couple of development organizations have pushed too much into the let's promote farm production diversity area without sufficiently acknowledging the market aspect of it. And that's true for some larger development organizations as well, also for grassroots. I mean, it has been en vogue, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with when you know a particular context very well to introduce additional crops when you have the evidence that this is working nicely. But I think the general assumption that introducing additional crops will always and automatically lead to improved nutrition. That's something that I would like these development organizations to take a closer look at. I mean, I think national organizations have an important role to play, and I think oftentimes the agriculture ministry is different from the nutrition and health ministry, and obviously that holds true in most countries. And I think there's still, even though we have been talking about this for a number of years now, there's still too little cooperation, and the Agricultural Extension Service, which is usually under the Ministry of Agriculture, they could play an important role in behavioral change communication also from a nutrition perspective. So I would really hope that the topic of agricultural nutrition health linkages is taken seriously, not only in terms of the international organizations, but also really at the local and national levels. And then, yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether, I mean, obviously, it's hard to say what is the thing or the organization, but I think pinpointing, one organization that does things wrong is not true. I mean, I think every organization has the best intentions, and we need to see how the scientific evidence can feed into this in order to make things more effective. And in the end, there is nothing like a silver bullet. I mean, we cannot expect that one approach will solve it all. And therefore, I think we all need to be open to other new ideas, new evidence, and see how to really build on the synergies that may be there.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. We tried, but you all had really fantastic thoughts, and we really appreciate you all joining us. And Matin, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights in your research.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Great. See everybody tomorrow, same time, and we'll have Harold Alderman of IFPRI, formerly of World Bank, joining us. See you tomorrow.